Most people still think of Florida in a very simple way. It is the place you go when life gets too expensive somewhere else. Lower taxes, warmer weather, cheaper housing. A fresh start that feels just a little easier. And for years that idea made sense. Millions of Americans moved there for exactly that reason. But something has quietly changed, because Florida is no longer just an escape from high costs. In many ways, it is becoming one of the clearest examples of how modern financial pressure actually works. Not in a dramatic collapse, not in a sudden crisis, but in a slower, more confusing way. A place can still look like a paradise on the surface, while becoming harder to live in underneath. And that is exactly what is happening. This is not really a story about Florida, as it is a story about what happens when the idea of affordability starts to break down, and why the place that once felt like the solution is now starting to feel more complicated than people expected. For a long time, Florida sold a very specific version of the American dream, not the traditional one built around career growth and big cities, but a different version, one based on lifestyle, sunlight instead of stress, space instead of density, lower taxes instead of higher income, a house that feels achievable, a pace of life that feels manageable. For retirees, it meant freedom. For families, it meant a second chance. For remote workers, it meant finally escaping the cost pressure of major cities. And for a while, that logic worked. Florida did offer lower taxes, and it did offer more housing for the price compared to places like California or New York, and it offered something harder to measure: a psychological reset, the feeling that life could still be simpler somewhere else. But that is where things get more complicated, because once a place becomes known as the escape plan, it starts absorbing pressure from everywhere else. More people arrive, more demand builds, more housing gets developed, more money flows in. And slowly, the conditions that made the place attractive begin to change. Not all at once, but enough to shift how it feels to live there. This is where many people get caught off guard, because affordability is not just about the price you see when you buy a home, it is about what it takes to stay there. Mortgage is only one part of the equation. There is insurance. There are property taxes, there are utilities, there is maintenance, there is transportation. And in Florida, there is something else that matters a lot more than people expect. Risk. Flood risk. Storm risk. Infrastructure risk. And the financial consequences that come with those risks. This is what people often miss when they compare states. They look at the headline numbers, but they do not always see the full cost structure underneath. And that structure is what determines how heavy daily life actually feels. In Florida, that structure has been changing. Not in a way that makes headlines every day, but in a way that slowly builds pressure over time. A home that once felt affordable can feel very different when insurance costs rise. And a move that once looked financially smart can feel less stable when multiple small expenses begin stacking up. And that stacking effect is important, because financial pressure rarely comes from one single number. It comes from accumulation. 10 small increases feel heavier than one big one, especially when they are spread across different parts of daily life. This is why people often say things feel more expensive even when inflation numbers start to cool. Because the lived experience is not about one category. It is about how everything adds up. And Florida is a very clear example of that. Because the state still attracts people. It still grows. It still builds. It still sells the idea of a better life. But at the same time, the cost of maintaining that life has become more complex. And that creates a very specific kind of tension. The outside still looks appealing. The inside feels more demanding. That gap between expectation and reality is where the real story is. And it is not just about housing. It is also about the structure of the economy in Florida. A large part of the state runs on tourism, hospitality, retail, service work. These are industries that keep the economy moving. But they do not always provide the kind of income that matches rising living costs. So you end up with a situation where the state looks prosperous from the outside. New buildings, busy airports, luxury developments, record tourism numbers. But underneath that, many workers are dealing with a very different reality. Longer commutes, higher rent relative to income, less financial cushion, and more exposure to unexpected costs. And this creates another layer of pressure, because the system still functions, but it becomes harder for the average person to feel stable inside it. This is one of the reasons why Florida feels so intense compared to other states. The contrast is sharper, the lifestyle image is stronger, the expectations are higher, and when reality does not fully match that image, the gap becomes more noticeable. This is also where psychology plays a major role. Because financial stress is not just about numbers, it is about whether life matches what you thought it would be. If a place is expensive, and always has been, people accept it more easily. But if a place was supposed to feel easier, the disappointment carries more weight. And Florida has one of the biggest expectation gaps in the country. And it is marketed as freedom. But increasingly, it requires careful financial management to sustain that freedom. That does not mean Florida is failing. It means it is changing. And that distinction matters, because the goal is not to replace one extreme narrative with another. Not paradise, not collapse, something in between. Florida still offers real advantages. The weather is real. The lifestyle is real. The tax structure is real. Opportunity still exists. For some people, moving there still improves their quality of life, but the full picture is more complicated than the simple version people often hear. And that complexity is exactly what makes Florida important, because it reflects a broader shift happening across the country. Affordability is no longer just about finding the right place. It is about managing the full cost of living once you get there. It is about durability, not just access. Can you not only afford to move somewhere, but afford to stay there over time? That is the question more people are starting to ask. And Florida forces that question into the open, because it combines so many pressures in one place: rapid population growth, high housing demand, environmental exposure, insurance volatility, a service-driven economy, and a powerful lifestyle narrative that continues to attract new arrivals. When all of these factors interact, the result is not collapse. It is strain, and strain is harder to see. But it is also more important to understand, because it shapes how people actually experience their lives. This is why simple explanations do not work anymore. Now, saying Florida is still cheap misses the hidden costs. Saying Florida is unaffordable misses the continued demand and opportunity. The truth sits in the tension between those two ideas. And that is where the real insight is. The economy may not be collapsing in a dramatic way, but something meaningful is shifting. The old belief that you can move to a better location and solve your cost of living problem is getting weaker. Because the trade-offs follow you. Maybe you save on taxes, but pay more in insurance. Maybe housing looks cheaper, but maintenance and risk are higher. Maybe lifestyle improves, but financial stability becomes less certain. And that does not just apply to Florida. It applies to a growing number of places across the country. Florida just shows it more clearly, because everything there is more visible. Now, the growth is faster, the risks are higher, the contrasts are sharper, and the gap between perception and reality is easier to feel. That is why Florida matters, not because it is unusual, but because it is revealing. It shows what happens when a place becomes too attractive for its own original promise. It shows how quickly affordability can shift when demand accelerates, and it shows how financial pressure evolves. Not as a sudden event, but as a layered experience, a series of small changes that gradually reshape how life feels. And once you understand that, the story becomes much clearer. Florida is not just a destination. It is a signal. A signal that the way people think about affordability needs to change. It is no longer enough to ask where life is cheaper. Now, the more important question is where life remains stable over time, because stability is becoming the real challenge. Not access, not movement, but sustainability. And in Florida, that challenge is impossible to ignore, because this is a place where paradise and pressure now exist side by side, where opportunity still attracts people. But complexity determines whether they stay. And that difference is what defines the modern cost of living, not just in Florida, but increasingly across America.